So the dark triad, there's nothing special about it. It's just a shorthand term that Del Paulis and Kevin Williams came up with in 2002 to quickly refer to three of the most studied and harmful personality traits that humans can possess, which is psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. Now, a lot of people listening to this are probably thinking I'm a clinical psychologist, and I am not. I study everyday personality in the normal range. All of us listening to this, all of us out there have variations on all three traits.
Welcome to the Psych and Business Podcast. We're here to show you how practical psychology can be useful and make your workplace better. I'm Dr. Ernest Wayde. All right, I have a very, very unique guest for you today. He's an expert on toxic personalities and abusive leaders. And I'm sure we've all had some of those. His name is Dr. Daniel Jones, and he is an associate professor of management in the College of Business at the University of Nevada, Reno. Dr. Jones is a leading expert on the differentiation of the dark triad and the prevention of harm from individuals with dark triad personality traits. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Really glad to have you here, and I know we're going to talk about some really interesting stuff, but before we get into that, I'd love for you to just tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about how you got into this kind of work and how you are in the position that you are now.
So, unlike a lot of the research projects I had started off on early in my career, that was kind of me search more than research. I studied things like romantic relationships to try to understand why I couldn't get a date, things like this. But ultimately, I discovered Del Paulis and his website, and I had some interest in kind of the dark side of psychology. And when I saw, as I was trying to get into a graduate program, I saw the work he was doing. I was very inspired by him and his research. And I was gravitated to it out of truly raw interest. And I think one of the reasons why the research has been successful is because I didn't go into it with a preconceived agenda or how the data were supposed to come out or fit my life. Instead, it came out with a pure, let's see where this goes. And so worked with Del. I still talk to him. He's a fabulous guy. Wound up starting off out of graduate school in legal psychology at the University of Texas, El Paso. And so I studied a little bit of white collar crime. I was focused on more financial crimes and ultimately got interested more in the business side of psychology and found myself gravitating towards questions on management and leadership and organizational behavior. And when the opportunity to go to a business school at the University of Nevada, Reno came up, I applied and I was very fortunate to get the position. So I'm full steam ahead on these toxic personalities in the workplace. And I truly consider myself an interdisciplinarian between psychology and management.
Yeah, I love that combination of experiences that you've had, and I love that you were able to come into this kind of with an open, learning mind. Let's jump right into it because I'm really interested. First, help us understand, what do you mean when you say dark triad? What is the dark triad? And then walk us through how you identify, those dark triad personality traits.
So the dark triad, there's nothing special about it. It's just a shorthand term that Del Paulis and Kevin Williams came up with in 2002 to quickly refer to three of the most studied and harmful personality traits that humans can possess, which is psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. Now, a lot of people listening to this are probably thinking I'm a clinical psychologist, and I am not. I study everyday personality in the normal range. All of us listening to this, all of us out there have variations on all three traits. It's not being completely absent of narcissism is not necessarily functional. All of us have traces of these things, some more than others to varying degrees. And so we study them in the everyday, or what we call the subclinical range. So I usually don't study people who are in prison or forensic populations or in some kind of court mandated trouble. I'm studying people in everyday work situations, classroom situations. So we study it at the personality range. And really the dark triad and dark tetrad, if you want to include subclinical or everyday sadism in it, really it's just a shorthand term for kind of these people who, what unites them is they lack empathy, so they're all callous, and they lack honesty, they're all manipulative, so they don't care about you and they don't care about the truth. That chunk right there is what unites them and makes them overlap when they deal with interpersonal situations. But other than that, they have very little in common beyond the callousness and manipulation that they share.
Yeah, that's really interesting hearing that, and I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking about some people that I know and trying to figure out, okay, so it's not that they're necessarily clinically diagnosable, but it's something that we all have, and they're just using it more than they probably should, and it's coming out as an abusive way in which they behave and respond to others. So I know you've done some work with helping identify these individuals in leadership roles. So talk to us a little bit about kind of that work and how you deal with someone like that, especially if they're your boss.
Hmm. Absolutely. So one of the things that I don't want is for people to see these folks everywhere in their sleep and such. Uh, I believe that when you enter a situation, we are inherently one step behind these characters because they're going into a situation premeditated, wanting to manipulate. I believe to preserve humanity, we should go into situations giving people the benefit of the doubt. We should, trust but verify is the mantra I have. So when you go into a workplace situation, I don't want people thinking automatically their boss must be a narcissist. And even if there is an issue with the boss, exhaust all legitimate channels first: external explanations, situational explanations, life circumstance explanations, communication difficulties, before you start considering the person might have some kind of rigid personality trait that's leading them to behave this way. Very often, most of the time, this toxicity and this harm comes from a misunderstanding, a lack of communication, or a sensitivity that can be dealt with. And so I encourage people to exhaust those kind of external and other explanations first.
So it's like
But
saying just
ultimately,
because your boss does something mean to you or something that you don't like, it doesn't necessarily make them in the dark triad. It just means they might be having a bad day or there might be a situation going on before you start labeling them. Am I understanding that correctly?
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I'll give a personal example. I several months ago, my two dogs got into medication, and that can be human medication that can kill them. And so I had to rush them into the car and rush them to the dog ER. And I'm swerving in and out of traffic and blasting through, people, and somebody was, giving me hand gestures and things as I'm doing it. And the assumption dispositionally often was that what a narcissistic driver,
Yeah.
but no,
What a jerk.
I'm genuinely in yeah, right. I'm genuinely in a panic right now. Please understand, I'm not trying to be a rude driver. I want to save my dog's life. They turned out okay, by the way, but very often we knee jerk to that reaction of somebody cuts us off in traffic, they must be a narcissistic driver. So I would encourage at work to kind of attenuate that desire to make dispositional judgments before you have adequate information. But if you do exhaust those legitimate channels, trust but verify, and ultimately what you're verifying is that this person has some maliciousness to them, dishonesty, callousness. Now you're entering the realm of what we're going to talk about. And so what I would suggest, the first thing is do damage control. So be careful what you say in general. You should always have a professional veneer, especially what you put into writing. But now your guard should go up, and you should be hyper aware of what you say around this person and the politics surrounding this person. Ultimately, the best ways to win a fight, as many people would say, is not to be in one. And so if you know somebody has a toxic streak to them, getting away is always first and foremost and paramount. There is no definitive way to outwit these people because they're always one step. If you have empathy and honesty, you are in a way handicapped in that situation because they don't have the ethical and moral constraints that you do. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think that morality, ethics, kindness are all good things. But unfortunately, because you hold yourself to a higher standard than they do, they have less constraints in their negotiating the situation than you do.
So why is
So
that
you'll
important?
never win.
You said
Mm-hmm.
you got to be careful of what you say. Why is that important? If you can't get away from that situation, if you're not able to quit your job and find another job, how does watching what you say impact that situation?
That's a great question. So one of the things that we find in Machiavellianism, and there was a court case I was consulting on several months ago, where an individual would leverage personal and social relationships, romantic relationships, romantic interests of friends, of relationships, to start up a company. And very often within the company he was working in, he would use information that he gathered to boost his situation and sometimes compromise the situation of those he believed were competitors. So anything you say to a Machiavellian especially can and will be used against you in the court of public opinion.
Wow.
And you are going to have to be very careful about what you said because the words are going to be twisted. Same with narcissism, same with psychopathy. These folks have no particular affinity for the truth, like we mentioned. And as a result of that, anything you say that alludes or can be misconstrued will be misconstrued in a way that casts you in the most negative possible light and casts them in the most positive possible light. And one of the things that you have to understand is you don't want to go into the arena with these people because they've been practicing and doing this. They have much more experience doing this type of stuff than you do. So you're not going to go head to head with a narcissist and show everybody how terrible they are and how wonderful you are. And the narcissist is going to fall to their knees and say, oh my God, I see the light. I've been evil this whole time. Thank you for showing me. Disabuse yourself of those fantasies.
So this is not a movie, is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. And at the end of the day, I have a colleague who had a narcissistic coworker, and the coworker was constantly leveraging the interpersonal interactions, opportunities where she could show up to a particular event, meeting, committee, where he couldn't, and highlight the fact that she was there and he wasn't. And it was a very twisted game. Ultimately, what ended up happening, and I advised my friend, is you have to let it go. You have to focus on your journey and what you can do in damage control. You are never going to get the upper management to see her for what she is because she's grooming them. Okay. So again, I have to emphasize you should not do battle with these people because ultimately they've just been at it longer than you. Right. And I don't want to see anybody slip to this kind of callous, manipulative style of interpersonal dealings with people. So ultimately what you have to do in those situations is understand you are going to have to do damage control in some situations. So that's what I mean by be careful what you say. It can be misconstrued. It will be misconstrued. The best way to deal with them is over email, text, anything that can lead to a paper trail or cold media, because not only do they lose their manipulative ability over emails and things like that, but you also provide a documented paper trail. Now, that doesn't necessarily help you with somebody high in Machiavellianism because they are cautious of the three traits, are the most cautious, or the least likely to put something incriminating or damaging in an email or in a paper trail because they're already one step ahead in the way they're thinking about how to manipulate you. So ultimately, that's why I say get away if you can. That is the best solution. But if you can't, one of the things I talk about in my TEDx talk, TEDx Reno, is CBR techniques. And what that stands for is be cold, bottom line, and rational. Okay. You are going to, one of the things that we find with narcissists especially, but all three of these types, is emotional whiplash. If they were just rude to you constantly, aggressive constantly, it would actually be easier to deal with them. But the narcissistic individual in a one-on-one situation may pull you in and say, hey, give you a compliment, flatter you, make you feel welcome, and then cut you off at the knees in a particularly important meeting with a boss or stakeholders where they can look good and make you look bad, right? And so you get this emotional whiplash when you're dealing with these types of people. So you have to look at the situation coldly and objectively, especially if it's a boss. Say, this boss holds the purse strings for my money, so this boss is a vending machine for me. I'm going to put effort in and I'm going to get money out, nothing more. You have to start to look at the person objectively. The second one is bottom line. Why are you there? If you can't leave, and I legitimately understand, a lot of people have emailed me, talked to me and said, look, I can't get out of my job. I have a sick mother. I have children to take care of. I'm location bound. This is the best job. I can't afford the rent or the mortgage if I can't. So if you're there for that money, then remind yourself of that. Remind yourself of your family. Make salient reminders of your family or your mother in the environment. And then the last one, as I've alluded to, is rational. You are not going to one-up them in the court of public opinion because their whole existence centers around how people see them, their reputation, their ability to maneuver through these political situations. So be rational.
Yeah.
If the paycheck is what you're after, do what you can to sustain that paycheck. Now, I will say, Ernest, you don't want to do this as a default. Like I said, these are stopgap techniques to get through the situation until you can get away. But you can't do this in perpetuity.
But I'm also hearing what you're saying is instead of trying to change them or address what they're doing or trying to go into battle with them, it's really important to try to do the things that are within your control, focusing on you and how you respond and react to some of these manipulations so you can minimize the impact on you. Am I hearing that correctly?
You're absolutely hearing it correct. And again, when organizations have transformational leadership or good culture, and you have one bad apple or one toxic leader in that bunch, very often you can get sucked into, we're a family, we need to do for the company, we need to sacrifice for the company. When that toxic leader steps in, though, they become a black hole of all things positive. They suck it all in and they don't give anything back, right? And it's an eternal sucking of all the positives out of the life of the organization. So you have to shift your focus now behind doing selflessly for the organization and survival. Now you need to switch into a survival mindset where the challenge is doing what you can to feed that bottom line in the most rational way possible and not get emotionally involved in it. And like I said at the beginning, I don't encourage people to default to this setting. Again, if there is a legitimate miscommunication between you and your boss, if there is maybe you are going through something and you're misinterpreting, always therapy, I think, is excellent for everybody. I see a therapist. I encourage people to see therapists. I think everybody can benefit from it. And if you're in that situation, you should be seeing a therapist, whether or not you're dealing with somebody who's high in one of these traits. But ultimately, again, like I said, exhaust those legitimate channels. They're excellent. There's a great TEDx talk. Actually, I shared the stage with a guy named Leif Babin, who gave a talk on leading up, a former Navy SEAL who's a CEO of a consulting company. And so, I would say exhaust those channels first. Try to lead up, sit down, have an honest heart-to-heart with the communicator. Careful what you say, but definitely engage in that conversation first before you start using these techniques alongside somebody who may not fit the description of a dark triad person.
I'm thinking about what you're saying, and I'm also thinking about the conflict with how you respond to some of these things and what we know about organizational culture, right? In terms of if you start focusing on yourself. So I know you do a lot of research on this. What does the research tell us about the impact of an abusive leader like this on the culture of an organization? I mean, it seems like it would be pretty hard.
It is. And so toxic exploitative leadership are usually the downstream results of being narcissistic or Machiavellian as a leader, right? And so what we see as the subordinate is the abuse. What we see is the exploitation. But that's not a trait. Those are the downstream correlates of that. And again, it could be your immediate supervisor is exploiting you because their immediate supervisor is exploiting them. And so we have to make sure that this is a dispositional reason as to why the person's being exploitative towards us. Otherwise, if it is a solvable problem, solve it, right? But as you point out, if you have an exploitation of a leader or something of that nature, what you ultimately are going to run into is a rancid culture, because now people realize it's every person for themselves. Yeah. Now they realize if I don't do for myself, I'm next on the chopping block of the boss, so I have to get in the boss's good favor and maybe feed a little information about the coworkers, throw them under the bus and things like that. So it does create backbiting, backstabbing, and a rancid culture. Every once in a while, I have talked to people who find a diamond in the rough in that type of culture, and they can bond with a coworker, a trusted coworker, somebody who sees the situation in the same light that you do, in the same reality that you do. And those trusted coworkers are worth their weight in gold. Those are the types of people who we generally form even stronger bonds with than under a good culture, because we're surviving this storm together. Most of the time, however, it creates that backstabbing.
That's a good point. What about if we flip it, right? So what if you're the boss and you have an employee that behaves in this way, that has demonstrating these traits? How do you manage that?
That is a really great. That is a fantastic question. So one of the things that I've talked to several leaders, both in the military and private industry, who have faced those situations. It is inconvenient at the very least, and it is dangerous at the highest levels to discipline somebody who has one of these traits, who's spreading toxicity within a culture. And as a leader, you can sweep things under the rug and make them go away and try to do minimal damage control to move things along. I would say that is not the way to go. Because ultimately what you're facing, as difficult and challenging as it is to discipline a narcissist or somebody high in Machiavellianism, because they will go right over your head. They will go to your supervisor. They will spread negativity about you. But if you don't do that damage control, other good-hearted, otherwise just trying to survive employees will take note. And they'll say, oh, I can get away with the backstabbing and the backbiting and the exploitation. And that actually is a way to get ahead, because this person's getting ahead doing the things they are, and there's no repercussions. So just for the sake of your culture, for the sake of your climate, you must hold people, subordinates who are engaging in these toxic backbiting behaviors, accountable, because ultimately they will become the epicenter of a much larger problem now within your organization. Yes, it's going to be difficult. Yes, there's going to be retribution. They will spread lies and toxicity about you, but the alternative is far worse.
Yeah, I love that. I think one of the things that one of the sayings that I really enjoy is the one that says, you promote what you permit, right? And so if you're permitting this, you're promoting it and telling your other employees this is okay for you to do. And so it's absolutely important that you hold that individual accountable, but also be prepared for the backlash. It sounds like you're saying, right? Because there is going to be backlash.
You have to unfortunately, you have to cross your T's and dot your I's. I was just in a meeting about academic dishonesty the other day, and a lot of the faculty were saying, yeah, this is a lot of work for us to document all these things. And the dean, I think appropriately so, said, yes, it is. However, if you don't do your due diligence and report somebody, the next time they do it, that'll be the first time they're documented. And so if this person has done it 5 or 6 times, but it's been overlooked each and every time, then the 6th time looks like the first time to upper management.
Yeah.
So documentation becomes your absolute friend on this. And one of the questions I was asked when I was giving a talk at the Nuclear Research Institute Summit was, what happens when we have behaviors that don't necessarily rise to the level of crossing a line or abuse, but rises to the level of irksome and problematic indication. And one of the things that I have to say, without looking like a tattletale, is to document these cases. You need to bring them forward and make people aware, and double check with a trusted party, even outside of the organization. Maybe it be your partner, maybe it's a professional in HR person who isn't necessarily part of the company, and say, like, should I report this? But keep a paper trail as much as you humanly can of the infractions, because ultimately, if there's no documentation, there's very little HR or a leader in the know can do without pursuing it through the legitimate channels.
Yeah, I know I work with HR companies, and the thing that I hear the most is that from the legal representation is you have to document everything. You have to document all the behaviors. Yes. It doesn't matter how you document it, where you document it, on the back of a napkin, but you have to document it. If you don't document it, it didn't happen, essentially, and you don't give them anywhere to go.
And this is where Machiavellianism becomes the trickiest and the slipperiest pickle of these three, because they know. Whereas narcissistic individuals, when their egos get threatened, they lash out and they say things. Later on, they might say, that was not a good idea to say. Individuals high in psychopathy are rather bold and reckless, so they don't really think it through. But Machiavellian individuals, they're not going to say much to you in public unless they're okay with it being public. So they are one step ahead. There's actually a great paper out of Hungary that shows individuals high in Machiavellianism actually spontaneously mentalize in social situations the next move, what you might do and then what they would do in response. They see human interactions as a chess match. And so it's going to be very difficult to document what they said, because they said it to you and it becomes he said, she said in a confined environment. So one of the things that I like to tell people especially when they're dealing with somebody who doesn't like put things in email, maybe they pull you aside after a meeting. Maybe they walk into your office and shut the door. I'm so sorry, I'm in a hurry, put it in an email, right? So I would encourage individuals dealing with a person like that to loop it back to a documentation and not engage in small talk or side talk with individuals whom you suspect are going to engage in this type of manipulation. Loop them back into it. Whether you have a meeting to run to or not is irrelevant. I'm sorry, I'm in a hurry. Please just drop me a line in an email about this. And so you can at least diffuse some of that one-on-one manipulation in private without having to deal directly with a lack of documentation.
Yeah, so I think this is really helpful, right? Because we've talked about if you have a boss that has these traits. We've talked about if you have an employee that has these traits. What about if you have a coworker that has these traits? Do you behave any differently?
So one of the things to be aware of in these situations is just like with the supervisor, anybody that's on equal or more powered footing than you, you have to be very careful about what you say, because there's a differential power dynamic than if you have a subordinate. Then you're worried about the other subordinates. But here you're worried about yourself, right? You're worried about your reputation. And there are three things that I want to highlight. The first is if you have a coworker who is Machiavellian or narcissistic, be very careful of your own behaviors. We have research showing that you do eventually gravitate towards the company you keep. So even if you are personally not harmed by the Machiavellian coworker, or maybe you're on their political good side because you have some value to them, or the narcissistic person sees you as one and the same of the successful people, so you're somewhat immune to their abuse, try to get away if you can. Divorce yourself from the individual or the company or the situation, talk to HR, whatever you need to do, because ultimately you do take on the characteristics of the company you keep. And we find people who have these types of friends, Machiavellian, narcissistic, eventually slip into unethical patterns of rationalization and thinking themselves. So be very careful, because narcissistic Machiavellian people raise the unethical temperature of the room. And so that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say for individuals who have to work with somebody like that is, again, stay rational, because if they did it to that person, the gossip, you may not be in the line of fire right now, but it's much like infidelity, right?
Good to you.
If she cheated on if she cheated on him with me, she's eventually going to cheat on me with that guy, right? And so it's the same thing there. If you may eventually cross over into their negative territory, and then the claws come out. So don't think you're immune just because you may be immune right now from the narcissistic or Machiavellian abuse. And then the third thing I would say, most importantly, is be careful who you can talk to, because these people are very charming, and they groom other parties, especially parties in power, to potential complaints, right? And one consultant I talked to, I remember, had told me this narcissistic mid-level manager had come in, and he told the upper management, I'm going to crack some skulls. I'm going to get this operation running the way it should. And so what crossed the line of abuse and was reported to the upper management as abuse was framed, already inoculated him towards being seen as abusive. It was seen as proactive, strong, task-oriented leadership, right? So he already groomed the upper management to frame the complaints a certain way. So be careful about what you say that isn't formally documented to HR or in a trusted party, because that person probably has their feelers out in multiple political pots. And if you start complaining about them, it could filter back to you.
This is so interesting. I think this is really helpful to know that even in the company of these individuals, even if you're not directly being impacted by it, you are being impacted indirectly, and there's a potential for you to become more like these people and behave more like them, because they make it okay, right? They normalize this behavior, and so it's easier for you to slip into it. So I think that's really, really important for everyone to be aware of that.
That's absolutely true. And not only do they just vicariously do this unconsciously, Machiavellianism in particular, it's a great study by an accounting professor named Pamela Murphy about 12 years ago. It's one of my favorite papers on Machiavellianism. And she showed Machiavellianism, when they do wrong, is associated with copious rationalizations for their wrong behavior. But those rationalizations have no association with guilt. What that tells you is that they are generating rationalizations a priori, ahead of time, to get out of trouble should they need them. But they're not doing it to justify it to themselves. They don't feel bad in the first place.
Wow.
Right? And so when you engage in dialogue over ethics with a Machiavellian, they're very persuasive about why it was okay to take that $10,000 and it was really theirs anyway, and things like that. And it starts to corrode your way of thinking, because those rationalizations are often very well thought out and compelling.
This is really, really interesting stuff. I want to ask, I want to say first, I think, as you said, firstly, that it's really important to not go to this immediately, right? You need to exhaust all the other options first, and in some cases, maybe seek professional help before you start diagnosing these individuals. But how do we reach out to you if we want to follow up on the conversation or have additional questions? Because I know this is really interesting stuff, and almost all of us have experienced this in some way, shape, or form, right? Across multiple industries.
Absolutely.
So how do we contact you and get more information?
So my website is all one word, darktriad.co. And that's probably the best way to find all the information about the work we do in the laboratory. I have fantastic graduate students and undergraduates who work with me as well on these questions. If you type in Dan Jones UNR, I pop up on LinkedIn. And my email is djones2, the number 2, at unr.edu. And I'm happy to field any and all questions that people may have. I am currently looking to work more closely with organizations and people in organizations, HR firms who are trying to tackle these problems. The work is never done on this front because they're always presenting us with new challenges. So absolutely, I'm open to any and all correspondence. I feel very passionate about this topic. And as I said before, most importantly, if you're listening to this and this all sounds so painfully familiar, realize if these people do have these traits, it's not you. They're going to make you feel like it's you. You're going to be gaslit and you're going to be struggling with what is reality because, gosh, I never said that. I didn't mean that. Understand that if you are truly dealing with one of these types of people, they're going to make it about your flaws and your problems. And it's not about you. It's about them. And get away if you can. I cannot emphasize that enough because ultimately you're never going to change them or the situation. What you have to do is take care of yourself.
Yeah. I love that. You've given us so much great information. I'm going to ask, what's one tip or one recommendation that you can give to the audience about this? Because I think this is really critical and important for people to be aware of.
Well, the most important thing, besides getting away and understanding it's not you, getting to therapy, the things we've already mentioned, is educate yourself a little bit more about these types of people. Understand the patterns of manipulation, the emotional whiplash that's going to happen. They manipulate in sequence. They will start, maybe the Machiavellian will start having a conversation with you. If that doesn't work, then maybe they go to coercion or gaslighting. Understand that these things come in sequence, right? I had a friend who had an abusive coworker at work, and ultimately he physically assaulted her. And what ended up happening was she went through steps that he went through. Initially, he tried to charm her back into, come on, don't go to HR, it'll be fine. Then he got aggressive and I'm gonna hurt you if you hurt me. And then ultimately he subjugated himself, saying, why are you ruining my career? Why are you ruining my life? By understanding how they operate, understanding the steps and the sequential steps under which they will operate, preparing yourself, educating yourself, you are at least equipped to understand what may be thrown at you, even though it still will be painful to go through emotionally. Educate yourself about the traits. You'll find that you will at least be forewarned, if not forearmed.
Yeah, I think that's such great advice, especially educating yourself about the way in which they might try to manipulate you so you can recognize the signs, right? I think that's really, really important, especially because these people are out there and they're all over the place. And so it's really important to be mindful and to be aware of when you're being manipulated or when you might be the target of one of these individuals. Daniel, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. It's been fantastic.
Thank you for having me. This has been fun. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, if you've enjoyed the episode, please consider subscribing and leaving us a review. Feedback is a gift, and we love gifts. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time.